With that, we're going to get started. I'm here to kick off this presentation of some really great information. There's two studies that United Way Monterey County has been very much a part of. The first one is the real cost measure, which is a statewide study of what it costs to live in a particular community broken down by various household types. And that is important data that can help us better understand the challenges of people living here in Monterey County and giving us some benchmarks and data to work with as we provide services to our community. The second study is the Impact Monterey County Assessment, and that is something periodically conducted in partnership with our Impact Monterey County collaborative, backboned by United Way, and that is an aspirational assessment, really where we go in and hear some very subjective or personal insights into people's experience living here in Monterey County. So we did our last assessment in 2022, and we are in the process of sharing out that information as well. So I think it's a little bit of the yin and the yang. We've got a lot of numbers coming from the real cost measure about economics, and then we've got a lot of narrative and personal experience coming from Impact Monterey County. So with that, our goal today is to share out the some key takeaways from those assessments, and then also enlist your ability and your perspective in thinking about how we make this information actionable and how it can inform our work here in the community. So with that, I'm going to start with our first presenter. I'm very pleased to introduce, so he's behind me, I'm in the middle of the room here, but we have Henry Gascon from United Ways of California, and he is the author of the Real Cost Measure, and he is here to tell us specifically what its findings are related to Monterey County. Thank you, Henry.
Thanks so much, Katie. I'm going to do a quick screen share here, so bear with me. And you should all be able to hopefully see this now. Magnified. So there we go. Great. So as Katie mentioned, I'm Henry with United Ways of California, and we're the state organization that helps to support all the local United Ways throughout California. And there's actually 28 local United Ways throughout the entire state. And we're really great to be partners with United Way Monterey County. We've known Katie for a long time and many of her staff, and we're really impressed with the work that she's doing here throughout Monterey County to help serve low-income children and families and communities. So it's a pleasure for me to be here today. So I'm here to talk about the Real Cost Measure, which is a study that we've been releasing since 2015 on what it takes to make ends meet here in California. So before we do that, I actually want to do a little bit of an interactive exercise with you. Imagine you're all part of a family of 4. You have 2 adults, 1 preschooler, 1 school-aged child, and think about the neighborhood that you live in. Family of 4. How much do you have to spend monthly on housing to make ends meet? Feel free to shout it out. Family of 4. What do you spend monthly on housing in your neighborhood? Go ahead, shout it out.
About $3,500.
$3,500? What neighborhood?
Marina.
Marina? Okay. Anybody in Zoom want to share? Feel free to unmute yourselves as well if you like. In Salinas, 1,500 at 2050. 4,500 in Salinas.
I think it's higher than that. Probably 4,000 or over that. Yeah.
What area?
In Salinas.
In Salinas. Salinas. Yeah. Any other guesses? Communities, family of 4, 2 adults, 1 preschooler, 1 school-aged child. What do you spend monthly on housing?
Housing.
Just on housing. Just on housing.
Just in housing.
Yeah.
Okay. 2,500.
Okay. 2,500 to 3,000. I'm like 4,000 seems really high.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I'm gonna stop. I think that's.
Yeah. We're getting into that. So actually, let's get into food. Family of 4, 2 adults, 1 preschooler. How much do you have to spend monthly on food to make ends meet?
1,000. Yes.
1,000? Okay. 1,000? Okay, yeah, a few Costco trips are probably involved with that, right? 1,000 on food. Okay. I see 2,000 on food. Wow. That's a lot for a family of four, right? Who knows how hungry those kids can get, right?
I'd say 50, yeah, 2,000.
Just on food. Wow. Okay. Really interesting. What about childcare? Preschooler, school age child.
That's like 2,000.
2,000. 2,000, okay, for childcare for a preschooler and school age child. Any other guesses? I'm looking at Zoom. For two kids, 2,500. I could easily see that. Feel free to unmute yourselves on Zoom if you want to participate. 720 on food, the minimum. Okay. All right. What about healthcare? Family of four, two adults, one preschooler, one school age child. Doesn't matter if it's employer sponsored coverage. What are you paying out of pocket? What does that look like? All your pharmacy visits. What does that look like per month? Yeah. It could be all the medical appointments, medical appointments. What does that look like?
Co-pays and everything.
Yeah, with
Probably
co-pays and
like
everything.
200 to 250.
200, 250 per month. Okay.
More like a house, right? Because if you're for independent health insurance,
Yeah.
it's expensive.
Right, your employer, you could be paying out of pocket
Yeah.
for your kids' health coverage as well. I see 700. Okay, what else for healthcare? Any other guesses? 1,000? Okay. So things are starting to add up, aren't they? Transportation. What does that look like per month? It could be a couple of cars. It could be public transportation. It could be gas. It could be maintenance, co-payments. What does that look like?
900.
Yeah.
900? 900 a month
2,000.
right now? Gas is getting a little bit more pricey right now, right, as well. 1,600 a month for transportation, I see. What else? 700?
You're making payments on two cars.
Yeah,
It's around 1,000 for 2,000.
yeah, absolutely.
Yes, maintenance.
Absolutely. Right, insurance? Yeah, absolutely. All right. So what about miscellaneous? Everything else? What does that look like after all those basic needs?
It's what's left.
You're like, what's left, right? Right. So that's the point. It's really expensive to live here in California, pretty much no matter what neighborhood that you live in. Right? And I'm certainly been feeling the impact on food and transportation, especially over the past couple of years in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. Right. So now I want to go ahead and keep those numbers in mind. Now I want to ask you about the official poverty measure. What do you know about the official poverty measure? How was it calculated? When was it founded?
Is that the test? I read something on the United Way that the cost of housing sets the price for everything else in the community.
The cost of housing has nothing to do with the official poverty level. Any other guesses? Any guesses on Zoom? You want to unmute yourselves? Want me to do that? How was the official poverty measure calculated?
Food.
It was actually calculated very famously during the 1960s, during Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. And very famously, an official within his Social Security Administration named Molly Arshansky was tasked by creating the official measure primarily by looking at the cost of food for many families during the 1950s and 60s. And essentially, that's how our official poverty measure is calculated, loosely on the price of 3 baskets of food. And one other thing, and it's adjusted for inflation ever since. And we've had that same official formula pretty much since the middle of the 1960s. And it's what's used to actually determine your eligibility for public benefits for those who are eligible for it as well. One important thing about the official poverty measure is that it treats poverty exactly the same way as it does in Alabama, Mississippi, as it does in California. It doesn't take into account geographical differences in the cost of living. So Molly Orshansky was born in Brooklyn, and she did a great job, but it was clearly outdated from the moment that it was created. So we created a new self-sufficiency standard. If I can find my phone to navigate the slides. There we go. Thanks. We created a self-sufficiency standard called the real cost measure to determine what it really costs to live here in California. And give me 1 second. I will navigate through these slides, and you should see it right here. So the real cost measure takes into account the cost of housing, food, healthcare, childcare, transportation, and other basic needs to determine what it really costs to live here in California. And the data that we use is focused on households because that's how we usually get the tax data that's usually reported in terms of household income. So the focus of the real cost measure is on households, and we exclude for two primary audiences. The first is seniors because they're not traditionally working households, even though we've seen many more seniors come into the workforce over the past few years. And we actually partner with UCLA and the Fielding School of Public Health to create the Elder Index. And overall, we're finding about 33% of seniors are struggling to make ends meet here in California. What's probably one of the biggest expenses for seniors to make ends meet? Medical, their healthcare, absolutely. Their pharmaceutical needs, those go higher, of course, as you grow up, and that healthcare costs often take a big, significant dent in a senior's budget as well. The other population that we exclude are households led by persons with disabilities. They also traditionally don't tend to participate in the labor force, but we found out 2% of households in California are led by persons with disabilities. So the primary focus is on working households. And one of the first things that we did to calculate the real cost measure is we calculated household budgets. So we looked at the average household income for up to one adult in a household, all the way up to 19 adults in a household for all 58 counties in California. It was a lot of math. So overall, it was over about 1,200 household budgets that we calculated for the real cost measure, representing a whole bunch of different family configurations, all the way up to 6, 8 kids in a household, in fact. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that all of the data that we use to calculate the real cost measure is from publicly available government resources. So we didn't make it all up. We just calculated and packaged it together. And the first thing that we did was we wanted to take a look at statewide level data for California. We also wanted to take a look at regional level data, such as the San Francisco Bay Area and Southern California. We also wanted to take a look at the county data. So we have data for most of the 58 counties in California. In some cases, we had to consolidate them because of small sample sizes, particularly in Northern California, right? Huge areas but small population. And one of the great things about the real cost measure is we actually have neighborhood level data, so we can take a look at what that disparity looks like within counties as well. And we know that Salinas is very different from other parts of Monterey County. So we'll have a little conversation about that as well. So I'm not going to wonk out too much on all the data sources that we use, but what I primarily want to emphasize here is that the real cost measure attempts to determine what's the minimum amount a household needs to earn to make ends meet. So in order to establish the minimum, we use fair market rent rates by HUD. That's what's used to determine Section 8 housing prices. And it's actually the 40th percentile of gross rents. But we know the cost of housing could easily be 40, 50, or 60% higher than that fair market rent rate. So it's a basic threshold. We use the low-cost food plan by the U.S. Department of Agriculture to estimate food costs. We use the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which has great county-level data on healthcare and transportation. We use 10% for miscellaneous needs. And we also have gotten really good in terms of calculating taxes, especially payroll taxes and childcare tax credits, which are really important for many working households here in California. Another important thing about the real cost measure that is different than the official poverty measure is that it takes into account geographical differences into the cost of living. So we know the cost of living here in Monterey is very different than Sacramento, LA, San Diego, and other parts of the state. So we wanted to reflect that in the data and really speak in terms of what it actually means to work here in Salinas compared to other communities, for example. So here's baseline. We've calculated that it takes 2 adults, 1 preschooler, and 1 school-age child at least $94,000 in income to make ends meet here in Monterey County, at the very minimum, right? You've seen that baseline that we just talked about. But if we take a look at the average income for a family who's below the real cost measure, who's struggling to make ends meet, let's try to paint that picture a little bit. Overall, we've calculated about 800 households in Monterey County that are falling below the real cost measure that have 2 adults, 1 preschooler, 1 school-age child. Their average income is about $53,000. Maybe there's a family member who's getting SSI, about $1,000 there. About $280 in CalWORKS, which is the California version of the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, TANF, the federal program, and about $727 from the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is one of the most successful anti-poverty programs that we have here in the US. So if this family was able to maximize that income based upon their wages and all the public assistance that's available to them, it would look about $55,000 in total income. Look at the gap of what it takes this family to make ends meet. It's over $38,000. So my question to you is, how do they do it?
2 families living in one house, 2 or 3 families living in one household, so they
Yeah.
don't have to pay that much rent.
Yeah, we've seen more cases of families that are doubling up, even family members and associated family members that moving in with the parents. We've seen a lot of that too. Some would try to negotiate with their landlord to see if they can pay half of this month's rent and catch up the following month. Some would actually skip out on going out for food, reducing their transportation costs. Families really would do anything that they can in order to make ends meet on a month-to-month basis. And it really varies from family to family. So it's really difficult to make generalizations about the sacrifices that families make every single day. One of the things that we've been learning as we've been producing the real cost measure is people have been asking, well, why is it hard for low-income families to save? And the bottom line is they can't. And one of the reasons why is because of inconsistent income throughout the entire calendar year. So we have Monterey County, one of the most beautiful agricultural areas here in the state. Many of them have inconsistent income throughout the calendar year based upon their need to do labor and what's available, right, in terms of agricultural produce and so forth. Same for retail workers, right? It's a holiday season. It's now the end of December. People are asked to increase their hours. They bring in new people to address all the holiday shopping, right? But December comes along and that need pretty much disappears. So they're asked to either leave their positions or reduce their hours. And that really generates inconsistent income throughout the entire calendar year. So for those in agriculture, for those in retail, for those in manufacturing, it's difficult seasonal work. And you never know what that income cycle is going to look like from month to month. This is the financial stress that many families have to experience throughout the entire calendar year and are often hopeful for tax season so that things like the earned income tax credit and other the California tax credit that recently materialized over the past couple of years, they're looking forward to that income to actually help them to pay bills that have been accruing over the previous months, right? So these are the challenges that many families are experiencing. So let's take a look at what this income looks like in Monterey County for the same family of 4, 2 adults, 1 preschooler, 1 school-age child, and compare it to other parts of California. And you can actually just see in Sacramento, this family of 4 would need about $87,000 in income to make ends meet at the very minimum. In Santa Barbara, where the cost of housing, you can actually see it getting higher up to over $28,000. This family of 4 would need to earn over $111,000 in income to make ends meet. And look at Marin County. We've calculated it would take a family of 4 with 2 adults, 1 preschooler, 1 school-age child, at least $146,000 in income to make ends meet in Marin County, right in one of the more affluent areas of California. So this is why talking about the geographical differences makes a huge difference. Where you live really matters. Right? So let's get it a little bit deeper into Monterey County. There's different examples here. On the first column, we have 2 adults. On the second column, we have that same example, 2 adults, 1 preschooler, 1 school-age child. Notice what happens when those kids get older, when they become a school-age child and a teenager. What changes between the second and third columns? Childcare, yeah, childcare goes from about 16,000 to about just under 7,000, right? So teenagers generally lead less childcare. Some do, right, for whatever reason. And what goes up? Food. Good observation. It goes slightly up to 13,000 to about 14,000 as well. Somebody made the observation less healthcare for older children as well. It really depends on family to family, right? Looks like the healthcare costs is pretty comparable there to about 10,900. So one of the things that we've learned is that the age of the children really makes a big difference in terms of a household's ability to make ends meet. And that's primarily because of the cost of childcare, right? So notice the food cost of food goes up. So the food prices, because of the teenager primarily, teenagers get pretty hungry, right? Especially at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right after school, after practice, sports practice. So they open the refrigerator door, kind of empty everything out. 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening comes by. Everybody's looking at each other, opens the refrigerator door, and they're asking, "Where's dinner?" This could be a good general intervention opportunity to talk about the cost of food with your kids, right? And get that knowledge for financial literacy going as well. And you can actually just talk to them, hey, this is how much we're actually paying for housing. This is how much we're paying for gas, for transportation. Give them a heads up in terms of what it actually costs to live as an adult, right? And they'll appreciate the sacrifices that you make even more, right? Especially when, next day when you take them to school in the morning, right? They'll be thinking about that. So great opportunities for financial literacy that the real cost measure provides. So here's our primary finding. We find that the official poverty measure, which is primarily based upon the cost of food, usually hovers between 12 and 14% throughout California. And I think it's pretty much the same here in Monterey County. But we find up to 34% of families throughout the entire state are struggling to make ends meet. And when we quantify that, that's over 3.7 million households. So here is California. And thanks to Brexit, it's primarily now the 5th largest economy in the world if it was its own country. Not that we're advocating for separation from the union, but this is what it looks like, right? 5th largest economy in the world, right? And we know that there are poor neighborhoods and wealthy neighborhoods. But you can actually see the degree of struggle that we're seeing in many areas of the Central Valley, San Bernardino, and even coastal communities. So for neighborhoods, we use a census designation called public use microdata areas. And what the census does, every decennial census, is that they consolidate neighborhoods to get a sample size of at least 100,000 people. The way that they do it actually is really hard. It's really hard science, right? So when we released the study in June, we had 2021 data, which is the most recent available. We know the cost of food and transportation has significantly changed since then, but it's the best data that we have. Right? And we were still using the neighborhood data from the 2010 census because the 2020 neighborhood data hadn't come out yet when we released the report in June. It came out like 6 weeks after, which is interesting. So just to show the huge disparities in terms of what it takes to make ends meet by neighborhood, we find 11% of families in Walnut Creek, Lafayette, Orinda, and Moraga are struggling to make ends meet, compared to 76% of families in East Vernon, kind of an industrial area of South Los Angeles, who are struggling to make ends meet. What a huge portrait. 5th largest economy in the world, and here we find over a third of our state's population struggling to make ends meet. So what does that say about our society that we live in? Right? Certainly raises big questions. In Monterey County, we actually find the rate higher than the state average. 38% of families here in Monterey County are struggling to make ends meet. And when we quantify that as 42,000 households. Does that surprise you? No, right? You know your communities far better than I do here in Monterey County. You actually see the agricultural workers, those in retail, those in manufacturing, are working every single day doing whatever they can to make ends meet. But almost 4 in 10 families in Monterey County are struggling to make ends meet. So this gives us some great opportunities in terms of what we can do as nonprofits, as a philanthropic center to and bring in our elected officials together, bring in the housing developers, bring them all to the same room and see what we can actually do together to help uplift the lives of low-income families in our community. The real cost measure gives us the data and the opportunities to do that. So here's what the real cost measure looks like throughout California by region. And you can see the Central Valley, as you would project, has pretty high rates, 39%, but even the Central Coast, 38% of families in the Central Coast, right in line with Monterey County, are struggling to make ends meet. And even compare that with Greater LA, 37%, which includes LA, Orange, and Ventura counties. So here's what it looks like among the 3 neighborhood clusters that the U.S. Census Bureau identified from the 2010 census. And actually looked up the new 2020 data. Unfortunately, these neighborhood cluster designations are exactly the same, going to be the same for the next 10 years, right? So this gives us an opportunity to, and notice how the eastern part of Monterey is consolidated with San Benito. And they did it because to consolidate the sample sizes to get it to at least 100,000 people. So it could be some opportunities for us to engage here with census officials that really and talk to them about. San Benito is really kind of different, right, in terms of what we're doing here in Monterey County, and we can engage some conversations about how to geographically cover the data, but this is what it is now. But you can actually see the huge difference. With Salinas, 47% of families in Salinas, 50% almost, struggling to make ends meet, compared to about 30% in the neighborhood cluster of Seaside, Monterey, Marina, and Pacific Road, which they treat as one neighborhood cluster. So we've been releasing this study since about 2015, but you can actually see the huge differences between the real cost measure and the official poverty measure. And look at what it looks like in 2014. We actually went back a year. 48,000 families fell below the real cost measure in 2014 here in Monterey County. But look at the official poverty measure, 14,000. That's huge. 2 different stories in terms of what we think to make ends meet. And if I play the brief history of the world over time through 2021, you can actually just see how the real cost measure and the official poverty measure has changed, right? So it's pretty interesting. But notice how the real cost measure is 336% higher than the official poverty measure here in 2021, a difference of 33,000 households. Those 33,000 households largely aren't eligible to receive public benefits because they are considered to be below the official poverty measure, but they haven't acknowledged the real cost measure yet as an official in the government tool yet. However, I'm glad to share that we've been working with State Senator Steve Padilla in San Diego, who actually created a cost of living bill based upon the real cost measure during the last legislative cycle. It didn't pass, but he's going to reintroduce it next year with the help of the Senate Pro Tem, which is going to be huge. So we'll see what it looks like, but we have our fingers crossed that we'll be able to create a far more better access tools for public assistance for low-income families based upon the real cost measure. So fingers crossed. Here's another interesting finding. We find that 96% of families who are falling below the real cost measure here in Monterey County have at least one working adult. And in fact, they're probably working 2 or 3 different jobs, right, throughout the entire day, different hours throughout the entire day as well. So what this tells us and confirms to us is that these are not families just looking for to take advantage of the public benefit system. These are hardworking families each and every day making whatever sacrifices they can to make ends meet. And we actually have some pretty good data on rate and the real cost measure. And 54% of Latino households here in Monterey County are struggling to make ends meet. That's almost 30,000 households, right? And if we take a look at the the best data that we have, we don't have enough data on Black households, unfortunately, here in Monterey County. But we were able to get these three different types. And you can actually just see Asian American households, 31% of them are struggling here in Monterey County. To change the narrative, though, in terms of showing it by numbers, here's what it looks like. Who's the second highest group struggling by number? It's white households. 10,000 white households who are struggling here in Monterey County as well. We also looked at the intersection between educational attainments and the real cost measure, right? So during the 1950s and 60s, if you graduated from high school, you were pretty much guaranteed to get a good access job that would be able to cover your household needs for many families, thanks to the cost of living during that time, thanks to labor protections. Maybe the percentage of unions in the labor force was significantly higher back then. I think only now about only 8% of California's workforce belongs to a union now. So that's significantly changed. And it obviously changes the competition level in terms of getting into the labor force. But you can actually just see, 70% of households led without a high school diploma today are struggling to make ends meet, and even 16% of those with a bachelor's degree are struggling to make ends meet. So that raises some interesting questions too. And we've been wondering, just asking ourselves, just out of the blue, is do families actually need a master's degree to help ensure their family's self-sufficiency? The jury is still really kind of out on that. Depends on where you live, what kind of 4-year degree that you have. But it's certainly raising some questions about the value of education. And even 38% of those with a community college background are struggling to make ends meet. I think the last data that I saw is that only 16% of those who enter a community college here in the United States go on to finish a 4-year degree. So it certainly speaks to like what opportunities, what access to barriers are creating that mechanism. What will be easier to help the transition between community college and 4-year degrees as well. Single mothers, we find 69% of single moms here in Monterey County are struggling to make ends meet. And when we quantify that, that's over 7,000 households. So just think about the sacrifices that single moms make each and every day. They're not only the breadwinner for their households, but they're also the entire emotional support system for their households as well. Making sure that their kids wake up in the morning at a proper time, are fed for breakfast, go to school, get their homework, go to bed at a reasonable hour. That's a lot. And for a single mom who's often working multiple jobs and probably different hours throughout the day, they're not often there at those key moments of those kids' lives to make sure that they're getting what that they need, that they're getting the work done that they need to do, right? So they often take care of each other, or they often rely on family and friends to help with those kids, and it's a big challenge, right? So it speaks to the financial stress, but also the daily emotional stress of what they have to deal with each and every day. We even have some data in terms of single dads. It's pretty much comparable with single moms here. 68% of single dads here in Monterey County are struggling to make ends meet. We don't often speak about single dads, but the challenges are great. Compare that to about 35% of married households. So 2 income earners doing whatever they can to make ends meet. And overall, we found that about 3,500 households led by single dads fall below the real cost measure here in Monterey County. But of those married households, we found that 19,000 married households are struggling to make ends meet here in Monterey County. 2 income households, probably working different jobs, different pay rates throughout the entire day to make ends meet. Right? Households with young children. And one of the biggest barriers that we're finding that's preventing them from making ends meet, particularly kids between the ages of 0 and 5, is the cost of childcare. So we know that childcare is expensive here throughout California. In some cases, we're even finding examples of families paying more for childcare than they are for housing, right? And it really depends on where that is in terms of the access to childcare that's available. Many families have to go travel long distances in order to find childcare. It's difficult to afford childcare as well. But also think about it from the other side of the childcare system, the childcare workers themselves. Most of them are actually working, have low wages, are struggling to make ends meet. There's high turnover within the industry, and fall below the real cost measure themselves. So one of the things that we've been trying to advocate for is to increase the reimbursement rate for childcare centers so that they are more stable, are able to open more doors, and to have less turnover within the less industry. And there's a great organization called the Child Care Resource Center, who's in our advisory board for the real cost measure, and they've been great partners with us in helping us to articulate the message in terms of the child care needs for low-income families. But overall, 12,000 households with children below the age of 6 here in Monterey County are struggling to make ends meet, and it's primarily because of the cost of childcare. Right? So the 2 primary barriers that we're finding that are preventing households to make ends meet are the cost of housing and the cost of childcare, pretty much throughout California, and that's especially true in Monterey County. And the cost of housing is significant, and pretty much no matter where you live. And we look at housing burden, which is a percentage of income that you're spending on housing. We find that up to 42% of families here in Monterey County are spending at least 30% of their income on housing. When we were growing up, we were kind of just told, never try to spend more than a third of your income on housing. It's pretty much impossible now, right? Even if you're above the real cost measure, it's a big challenge. We find 47,000 households here in Monterey County are spending at least 30% of their income on housing alone. Right. So this is a big crisis that we all have to deal with. It's not unique to Monterey County. It's a statewide problem, and it's becoming increasingly a national problem as well. You can actually just see a high housing burden. The high 44% families in Greater LA are spending at least 30% of their income on housing. 42% in San Diego, but it's pretty much high throughout the state. It's 41% here in the Central Coast. And we're even finding 26% of families who are above the real cost measure are spending at least 30% of their income on housing. So this is a bigger problem. It's increasingly impacting the middle class and those who are working each and every day as well. And one of the things that we've been experiencing and seeing is more college kids, when they graduate from school, they can't afford to live independently because of the high cost of housing. So they often come back to their parents' house, which actually adds additional strain to households there for multiple reasons, right? So we've seen teachers in the San Francisco Bay Area doubling up with each other as well, because teacher salaries aren't catching up with the cost of living too. We find up to 45% of families in Seaside, the city of Monterey, Marina, and Pacific Grove spend at least 30% of their income on housing, compared to about 35% in the eastern part of the county and in San Benito. I want to work on getting better neighborhood data as well, just as long with you. So if you guys want to talk with some census officials to see what we can do about San Benito County, I'll be more than happy to help you out with that. So now that we've taken a look at what it takes to make ends meet, let's take a look at what the median income earnings looks like in California. So we know the San Francisco Bay Area has a concentrated wealth, right? There's more affluence there, but we're still seeing even in East San Jose, for example, that up to 50% of families there are struggling to make ends meet. So that kind of masks that data as well in terms of the degree of struggle. If I were to zone in on the map, I could show you what that looks like. But look at the huge disparities in income. 160,000 in median household earnings in Santa Clara County, compared to about 55,000 in Imperial County, our neighbors to the south. Right? So it's a huge difference in terms of what labor opportunities exist, who lives there, and everything else. It tells a huge story, and you can actually just see the huge income gap between the San Francisco Bay Area and Northern California as well. And Lake Tahoe has been a kind of emerging area. We see more increasing concentrated wealth in Placer and El Dorado counties, especially over the past 10, 15 years. Here's what it looks like in Monterey County. And notice how the Monterey County median earnings is about 6,000 lower than the state median. So pretty interesting there, and you can actually take a look at the income disparities among neighborhoods. It's about 99,000 in Seaside, Monterey, Marina, Pacific Grove, compared to about 82,000 in Salinas as well. So big picture, right? Those are the real cost measure findings, and we actually wanted to take a look at some inflationary data over the period of the past few decades. And this is labor that I calculated from the Labor Department. I adjusted this for inflation after the study was released. And we found that between 1984 and 2021, California's gross domestic product, which is the value of all goods and services in the state, increased by 173%. But median household earnings only increased by 4% during that same time frame, which confirms to us the middle class hasn't gotten a raise in over 4 decades. And I think if I were to even go back to the 1960s or 70s, it would be pretty similar. And I think if I were to paint this nationally, this portrait would look pretty similar as well. I think this is a public health crisis. It's a mental health crisis, right? So the cost of goods and services continues to increase, especially housing, childcare, transportation, and food, especially over these past couple of years. I'm looking at your faces. You're just as astonished as I am in looking at this, right? But notice how the income to help cover those basic needs isn't catching up with the cost of living. It's a huge story, right there. So even going back to the end of World War II, this is national data directly from the Labor Department, right? And you can actually see how our net productivity since the end of World War II has been off the charts, higher than any other nation in the world, 165%. But notice how our reward for doing that work, especially since the late 1970s, has pretty much flattened out at 100, flattened out. And you can see that very clearly here on the map as well. So with that, I think I'm pretty much done talking, and I want to give some time for this community assessment to hear the results about that as well. But I want to emphasize that the real cost measure, we don't want it to live on a website and just sit there. We want this to be a real tool that families and community members use each and every day to help increase awareness to the cost of living here in California. So we have a whole bunch of interactive tools that you can actually engage elected officials with, other nonprofit partners, your city council members. Make this a community conversation in terms of there's some really great data that we just have for Monterey County, and we think that it needs attention and awareness, and we want to work with you to help uplift the lives of low-income families who are suffering from this. So we have a cool interactive calculator on our website. You can select Monterey County from all the other 58 counties in California, put in the age numbers of everybody in your household, and it will show you the minimum of what it takes to make ends meet here in Monterey County. It's a great little tool. The website is unitedwaysca.org/real cost. We're going to make sure you get the slides after this. If I don't mind, I'll share them with you and we can make them available. That way you can actually play with the calculator themselves. There's a one-page county fact sheet, which actually has all of the primary findings from the study for Monterey County. And I have one specifically for Monterey County, not just that doesn't also include San Benito. So I have one specifically for you. And we have legislative profiles that we just released about a month ago that actually shows the neighborhoods that are struggling by congressional district, by state senate district, and by state assembly district. So if you know an elected, you can actually show them the data and they'll immediately raise their eyebrows by looking at that map because that's my district. That's who I serve. These are the elected officials, right? These are the people who made me elected to begin with. You can actually show them the data and say, what can we do to address this? And being housing developers, right? They actually want to increase housing stock and make housing more affordable. Let's work with them and not blame them to see what we can do to help improve the cost of living as well. For those of you who love data, you can actually download the whole file, Microsoft Excel, right? Especially with nonprofits who are applying for grant applications, you can actually use this for your nonprofit grants. For foundations, you can actually put this as part of your RFP process to help address a community issue that you want to bring attention to and you want to support as well. For those of you who really want to dig into this with 20-page methodology, which shows how we did our math, right? You can actually just see that. And we've been lucky enough, ever since we released the study in June, gotten 150 press releases throughout the entire state, and they're all listed on our website as well. So keep spreading the word. That's why we're here today, is to raise awareness of the cost of living, and we're doing that through the real cost measure, and we're glad to work with United Way Monterey County in uplifting this message. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over so we can actually talk about our community assessment needs. Thanks, everybody.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to give Dylan a quick second to zoom in the camera because I'm going to remain seated. So hopefully the folks on Zoom can see my face. But to get us started, my name is Calissa King. I'm the Community Impact Director of Information, Referral, and Partner Development at United Way Monterey County. A very long title, and I do a lot of different things. But today I'm here really sharing about Impact Monterey County and our 2022 assessment. And just thank you, Henry, so much for your presentation. I think a lot of the points you hit on will be echoed throughout our assessment, but also even just the great ways of how we can leverage data as a community is so important so that we're using the same things when we're talking about, needs and aspirations and what it really takes to thrive here in Monterey County. And that really is closely tied in with aim of Impact Monterey County. So Impact Monterey County is a collaborative of partners from all different spaces and places coming together to identify the most effective ways to improve the quality of life in Monterey County. There's a lot of different ways we do that by uplifting different data sets, different practices as bright spots. But one thing that we've done is we work on this assessment process to really gauge needs and aspirations at a local level, because we know there's a lot of data that's collected about people, but oftentimes it's hard to find data that really engages them in terms of them being able to be part of the process and share their unique insights to how they experience life here in Monterey County, but also what goals they have for their community and for their families as well. So just to give us a little bit of history about our assessment process, the first assessment was administered in 2015, so it actually lines up with what Henry shared around the real cost measure of the time frame. That was made possible by a generous grant from Capital One to United Way, Monterey County, and that grant was for a needs assessment. So we got together, actually not me because I wasn't here yet, but we got together a lot of folks from a variety of different sectors to all work together in order to create that assessment. And it was unique, like I mentioned, because it looked at needs, but it also looked at aspirations. It was a huge undertaking, and by the time it was fully presented and rolled out, it was identified that the collaboration needed to continue, and that's where Impact Monterey County was actually formed. And then the findings from that have been used all across our county. I know United Way, of course, specifically has utilized those findings in terms of how we've thought about our priority areas, but they've been used in grants and other plannings as well in order to support and have better understanding of community member insights. We then also implemented this assessment in 2019, and it was much smaller in scale, but really engaged a lot of rich partners throughout our community, working directly with community members through community conversations and surveys, which I'll get into for the 2022 assessment, in order to provide insights. And as we know, quickly after 2019 came 2020. And so we pivoted our findings to create our 2020 report to the community, where we were able to speak towards how can we utilize these findings from 2019 to be helpful as we think about recovery from the pandemic when that comes. So it came out with our 2020 report to the community. Many of you on Zoom or in the room may have seen that report, but of course that came in 2020, and then as we approached 2022, so really in 2021, we realized community is in such a different place than we were at in 2019, and we're going to be doing ourselves a disservice if we're measuring things from a 2019 benchmark. So we really need to implement a 2022 assessment. And so through, yet again, really rich collaboration from many of you who I saw pop up in Zoom, and then also those in the room, we were able to implement our 2022 community aspirations assessment, and that's what I'll be digging into today. So can I have the next slide, please? And so our 2022 assessment was really comprised of two different components, one being the survey component and the other being community conversations. So to dig into the survey piece, we had both adult and youth surveys that were administered. They were done through paper and then also in online format, and we had them accessible in English and in Spanish. And something interesting and unique about this is that some of the questions mirrored what had been asked in 2015 and 2019, but we also worked with the data committee for Impact Monterey County to make adjustments so that the questions were really reflecting where our community was at now, so that the data could be more helpful, right? Because even small change was made for questions where we were talking about internet, for example, right, to understand more about barriers for digital literacy and the digital divide. So we made some adjustments, but a really notable adjustment was we implemented a randomization pattern with that adult assessment, not the youth assessment, because of how long it was, so that not all adults were asked every single question. They were actually asked 4 random sections and along with the demographic information. So that was really intentional to reduce the survey burden and hopefully create a more equitable participation for folks around our community, because we know that time is really sensitive and a lot of folks don't have a ton of time to engage with assessment. So it was something we did to try to make the survey more equitable. The youth survey did not have that because it's much shorter in length, but there are a lot of questions that are asked exactly the same between the two surveys, just more content in the adult survey. And then we also had our community conversations, which were done throughout our community. We had them in
Hi. Good. How are you?
throughout the county, but we had
Sorry.
them in person and then also in Zoom. And those were also conducted in English and Spanish, and then in a few cases in both through interpretation services, which was incredible to be able to engage folks all in the room. So that's just to understand really the components of what the data is I'm going to be sharing, is coming together of those surveys that were collected and then the community conversation insights. And if you look actually at the report, you'll see sections where we're able to weave them together.
I have a
Also, where
$100
we're
gift
really
card.
parsing out what was shared in the surveys and then what was shared in those conversations. Next slide, please. Awesome. So now to dig in, who actually participated in the assessment? So when we think about the total number of surveys collected, we had over
Thank you.
1,650 total surveys collected for adult and youth for the assessment. And those were collected, but then they went through a validation.
Oh, I wanted
I
that.
think you're muted.
It was outside the age range. So they have over 100 on the assessment, and then also progress. So they had to go beyond just the demographic section as well. We also filtered out surveys where they were just appropriated or completely unrelated responses to the questions that were being. Oh, sorry. Unmute. Oh, was I muted the whole time?
No, just,
Oh, okay.
okay, I think.
What about now?
Still showing up as muted. Oh wait, no, it's unmuted now.
Perfect. Okay, awesome. Was it just this slide? Do we know? Okay, I'll just start over on the slide. So I'm sorry to repeat anything that I shared, but you might be thinking who actually participated in this assessment. So we had over 1,650 surveys that were collected for adult and youth participants, but then they went through a data validation criteria. So we just really cleaned the data. So for example, if folks were outside of the age requirement, so if they didn't qualify, for example, for the youth survey, let's say it was somebody who was 50 years old who responded to the youth survey, that would be out of that age criteria. So we took them out of that data set, right? Along with folks who provided zip codes for where they live that were not in Monterey County. Also, we cleaned for data that maybe had folks that spent less than 100 seconds was the threshold we set on the assessment. So that would be less than 2 minutes on the assessment. We cleaned those out, along with folks who also who had only filled out the demographic section and then maybe signed off of the assessment. So those were some of the metrics we used, along with also, of course, taking out responses that were not actually responding to the question and maybe were inappropriate in some cases in content. So once we went through that cleaning process and that validation process, that resulted in 801 validated adult responses and 421 validated youth responses. So a total of 1,222 validated responses. I know that you're looking at the screen and you're thinking, I am not seeing that on my screen, because something I want to uplift and I think was really important to this assessment cycle is we changed the way that we thought about participation. Of course, we wanted as many folks as possible throughout our community to be participating in the assessment, but we also understood that it was really important that we focus on getting really an equitable spread of community members living throughout our community. community. So periodically throughout the implementation process, we looked at the surveys and where folks lived, because what happened in past assessments was we saw a lot of folks who maybe lived, for example, on the peninsula participating in the assessment. So it really wasn't super representative of our community as a whole. So throughout that implementation period, we started to look at where are we seeing overrepresentation, and you'll see kind of on that last column for where it says population in bigger font. I know it's harder for the folks in the room to read it. That's comparing against census data. So we were looking at the census data for the different geographies throughout the region to see how are we matching up? Are we close? Are we seeing overrepresentation in some areas? And if so, does that make sense? And then we really worked with strategic partners who are working with the communities in these areas to try to bolster response rates, really improve. So a good example actually is you'll see for the adult survey, which is the middle column, you have a little bit over 15% present there. For North Monterey County. And originally, when we first started looking at that metric, it was the very low single digits in terms of percentages. So we were able to work with partners in North Monterey County to increase that so it's more representative than it would have been if we weren't looking at that specific metric and doing that intentional outreach. We saw most of the areas really improve and become a little bit more representative when compared to that census data than they were just, kind of naturally and organically when folks were engaged. So that was something different we did during this assessment process, and we're really intentional of how we reach out to partners and try to engage different community members. You will see, if you look at the youth survey, that we did have a lot of participation due to a really powerful partnership with the school district in North Monterey County of youth respondents in North Monterey County. So that one is definitely not reflecting, the census data that we had available to us, but I think it does create a space where we have a really powerful data set, especially for the youth in North Monterey County, in order to influence change and hopefully be able to bring their aspirations and needs to the forefront. So that's really exciting. But also I should say that with Impact Monterey County, we are able to disaggregate data sets and break it down in different ways by different regions. So that's not to say we couldn't do that for adults for a specific region as well, but just identifying that there really was a unique opportunity that presented itself through this assessment cycle with the amount of respondents we had in Monterey County, which is incredible. So can I go to the next slide, please? Thank you so much. So now we're going to dig a little bit into, we've created the space of where did we come from with the assessment, who participated, and now kind of digging into what did we learn. And I know for folks in the room, it might be a little bit tricky to read all of this on the screen, but what I want to highlight before we kind of dig into some of the community solutions and the data are these big overarching themes, and actually a lot of them echo what Henry was sharing with the real cost measure. So one really emergent theme that we saw throughout the assessment was housing. It was mentioned, typically you would think of housing as like a financial stability component, right? But it was mentioned in relation to a variety of different topics and sectors, of course in financial stability, but also health, work and education, and then community topics, so such as safety. Housing was mentioned as a concern, and I'll kind of dig into this a little bit later, but also really in relation to barriers as well. We also saw accessibility being an emergent theme, so being able to access resources, especially, and that was mentioned in relation to doctors, mental health, general health care, methods of transportation, receiving benefits, housing, and then safe places to exercise as well. Communication was another emergent theme across a variety of different topics. So thinking about how to access resources, availability for vulnerable populations, engagement with local officials and different departments, and then connecting parents with schools as well. And then a big one that definitely ties into the real cost measure is cost. It was mentioned in relation to a variety of themes such as higher education, childcare, household needs, health, food, insurance, and also was noted as we asked questions in the assessment around barriers to your, for example, like your desired level of housing or barriers to education. And cost was the number one barrier that we saw for most folks in relation to accessing their aspirations. We saw cost being a huge barrier for our community. So just to uplift these themes before now, we're going to dig into the actual sector. So it's important to understand that Impact Monterey County, we kind of frame our work in terms of 4 different sectors, so 4 different buckets, but we know that there's a lot of overlap, right? Of course, between buckets. So maybe we're talking about education, but so many different things impact education. But for the purpose of the rest of this presentation, I'll be focusing on financial stability, education, health, and then safety and peace is kind of some of the buckets. But I do just want to lend to there is about 60, I believe it's 62 pages of our community assessment. And so there's a lot of really incredible data. Of course, the community solutions section is great, and that's what we'll be focusing on. But I really encourage folks to engage with that. And like Henry said, really be able to use that as you create plans and apply for grants and think through new programs for your organization, and also how we understand needs and aspirations of community members. So with that, can we go to the next slide? We're going to be digging into our financial stability sector, and I will be kind of going over this and supplementing this solutions piece. So we asked some questions in our assessment this year around what could potential solutions be for some of the biggest issues folks were facing, right? So for example, right now we're seeing ways to improve financial stability. And before I kind of dig into what we're seeing on the screen, there was a really powerful quote that was shared and in our assessment process, and it was from a resident who stated, "Our credit cards are busting at the seams trying to make ends meet." And so we know that, of course, thinking about financial stability, that credit cards, right, aren't the most financially stable resource potentially, right, if you're not able to back that with being able to pay for them. So I particularly found that to be really impactful when we think about folks relying upon credit, but also being able to weave that together to make ends meet for their families. And so we see then with ways to improve financial stability, and you'll actually see quotes under each of these that are specifically from community members, either through most of these are through the survey process. They also could be engaging some of our community conversations too, but these are real words from community members in relation to these topics. So you'll see, for example, the top way was affordable housing. And so housing really, like I shared, being an emergent theme and really top of mind for a lot of folks that are responding to our assessment. And you'll see different quotes. So for example, one resident noted, "Reduce the cost of housing, provide more affordable housing for families starting out or single employed adults." And I know Henry in the real cost measure also uplifted, right, that single, moms or single dads, really that huge need at 68% not being able to make ends meet. Then we also see folks noting higher wages. After that, we have folks indicating a lower cost of living, right? So kind of both ends of that, increase the amount folks are making, but also bring down how much it costs to live. We see folks noting financial education as a really important piece to this. And I want to uplift just a point from those quotes that are underneath that box of residents are also specifically uplifting for our youth and for women in those 2 quotes. So really uplifting potentially vulnerable populations that don't have access to financial education in, traditional means. So that's, I think, really noteworthy and important. And then we also see targeted assistance, and just kind of thinking about that emergent theme around accessibility. We see the first quote saying, "More food banks on the weekends. I work during the week 8 to 5 and can never get to any open food banks," right? So we see that theme of accessibility also kind of shining through when we look at that piece. And one thing, there's a data point from the actual assessment that I want to share just to complement this. So we asked a question around, in the last 6 months, were you not able to pay for any of the following? And we give a list of really basic type needs like personal hygiene, rent, utilities, insurance, things like that, right? And the top response was 21% of those who responded to the question indicated that they were not able to afford their utilities. And then the second highest was 20%, indicating that they could not afford their rent or mortgage. So really thinking being able to afford housing, which I know Henry touched on, and then being able to live in that housing through the utilities, Those were huge. And to that same question, we also looked at how many folks responded that they couldn't afford one thing or two things or, multiple things. And we saw that 46% of respondents indicated that they could not afford one or more items included on that list. And 34% could not afford two or more items on that list. And like I mentioned, that list was really basic needs. And so we're really seeing, just like Henry, just echoing what he shared from the real cost measure, folks really struggling to make ends meet and afford very basic things that they would need in order to sustain themselves and, of course, their families. And like I mentioned before, and this is on the piece of affordable housing, when we asked one specific question about desired level of housing and then what barriers folks had in relation to their desired level of housing. And we saw that 4% no, their largest barrier were basic household expenses and necessities. 34%. And then that was followed by 32% indicating that they did not have the down payment for their desired level of housing, right? So that's also tying back into the financial stability and tying back into the basic necessities and basic, things folks need in order to live productive lives in Monterey County. Can we go to the next slide, please? Awesome. So now we're going to dig into our education bucket. So looking at education, you'll see the following solutions that are noted on the screen. So we have folks noting reduce costs and improve affordability, increase accessibility through flexible schedules and online options, provide more financial assistance and scholarships, expand vocational and life skills training, improve education quality and learning outcomes. So these are really kind of the big ways to improve educational opportunities that were identified. And so when we kind of look at that reduce costs and improve affordability, we asked a question in our adult survey around what were the biggest obstacles adults were facing towards education, right? And for adults who were currently not enrolled at the time of filling out the survey, the top barrier or the top obstacle was the cost of education. That was followed then by work-related reasons and then family-related reasons. And for those who were enrolled, we saw the top ones being cost, followed by work-related reasons, and in third, family-related reasons, right? So similar for those who are not enrolled and enrolled. But for those who are enrolled, there was actually a tie in second. They also indicated childcare was one of the biggest obstacles they were facing. So we see this important, I think, juxtaposition of what adults who are currently enrolled and those who are currently not enrolled in higher education saying, if for those who are enrolled, childcare is the obstacle that they're continuing to face, but those who are not enrolled but seeking and wanting to participate, they're not having that same barrier. So that's really important when we think about how we can best support, of course, CASE, right? That's across the board, but there is really this unique and emergent need for adults who are enrolled in education and that childcare component. When we then pan that to what youth indicated, youth noted that their top three obstacles were cost, so same. But then they, in second spot, noted not being prepared for further education. And then in third, we saw youth noting mental health. So that I think is really important because then when we actually pan back and look at adults, less than 5% of adults who responded to that question noted mental health. So we're seeing really unique and different challenges for adults and youth in relation to those obstacles of how they can pursue. Really, adults are based in supports that can be provided around childcare and cost, and like we see financial support in one of the solutions. But youth, there are really health-related needs there, and then other educational needs to have them feel that they're ready or be at the level that they're ready as well. I do want to note just in relation to point two, where it says increased accessibility and flexible schedules with online options. When we asked adults with children about internet in their home, over 90% indicated that their child has access to internet in the home. So just kind of thinking about that digital divide piece and some of the questions that we included, I think that that's really important and noteworthy. Of course, acknowledging there's still a lot of folks in our community who don't have access to internet in the home, but that a lot of folks have found that as a resource in their home, and really now we're looking for that flexibility through online scheduling in the adult space as well. And so moving on, I think it would make sense just for time's sake for us to hop down to the next slide, please. Awesome, thank you. So we're now in the health sector, and there are a ton of different community solutions for each of these sectors, but we're going to be focusing for the health sector on ways to improve access to healthcare services. So we see as the top one, make healthcare affordable. An interesting statistic from our survey was of those uninsured, 70% said that the cost of insurance was too high. So we have a lot of folks who are choosing not to participate in insurance just due to the actual cost, and that's not even, specifically the healthcare that they would be receiving. And second, we have increased the number of providers and facilities. This actually was a huge need that we saw really uplifted and aspiration throughout the surveys and throughout the community conversations. There was one resident in a community conversation who lives in Greenfield and noted that they could not get an appointment in Greenfield for 40 days. So that being a huge challenge. And of course, when you factor in transportation needs and just different, factors around barriers and accessibility, that can be a huge challenge if somebody's really having a severe health issue. There also, even on the peninsula, was a big concern around this as well with concierge doctors, right? So folks, especially as they age, and maybe not having the insurance they had before and having to pay a doctor that maybe they've seen for years, a large amount of money to continue seeing them so that they will build their new form of insurance because it had changed because they retired. And then there was also a really impactful quote that I wanted to lift up, that due to the lack of doctors, I have to go to urgent care and wait 2 to 3 hours to get help. So really a lot of concerns around the capacity and the number of providers. Then we see in third, hiring more diverse and bilingual staff. And something that was interesting was we asked questions in the assessment around, for adults, around when they're picking, like a healthcare provider, like what are they considering? And 27% indicated that they are looking for a provider who speaks their preferred language. So that I think aligns up perfectly with this. It's really important to consider, especially when we think about our really diverse community and the language needs that are represented. And I do just want to make a note that there was also a separate piece about translation services. So they're actually looking for providers who can communicate with them directly, not through translation or interpretation services. Then when we go to the fourth point, expand hours and appointment availability. And for that same question, we saw 20% were looking for expanded hours for later than 6 p.m. and 23% were looking for providers who were able to serve on weekends. So still really high percentage of folks are looking for weekends and late nights due to work schedules and a variety of other factors, but that's a need that they're really considering when they're looking for healthcare services. And then the fifth most community solution that was identified in the sector was accepting more forms of insurance. And this actually was the top thing that folks are looking for when they're looking for a provider. 75% indicated that they would look for a provider that would be able to host their insurance. But that's especially concerning when we then think about the number of folks who are uninsured and then also thinking about the cost of insurance, right? Before we leave this slide though, a really important data point that I want to uplift was we asked questions to adults and youth, the same question, around what were their top health concerns for their community. And adults uplifted the top health concerns. And if you're in the room, you would have seen this on one of the posters on the wall. Adults noted first, mental health, followed by street drugs, and then the cost of medicine. Where youth noted first depression, then bullying, and then mental health. So we can see between adults and youth, there really is this emphasis on mental health as being the most pressing concern. And I know there's a lot of conversations and collaboratives in our community working to address this, but I think that that's really important when we're thinking about all of these other components of how to improve access. This is the top concern, and how do we improve access, especially to mental health services for our community? And I do also just want to note that this is just particularly interesting was adults noted street drugs, right, in that top three concerns, and youth noted marijuana. And so when we had to compare the rates of those, we saw that youth thought marijuana was a problem at 5 times the rate of adults, and adults were more concerned about street drugs. So about 50% more than the youth respondents. So that's just interesting when we're thinking about substance use in our community and how folks are framing the problem and maybe the experiences that they're having with that space. So with that, we can go to the next slide. Thank you so much. So for this last one, so we're looking at the safety and peace sector. I really wanted to uplift safety, but you'll also see kind of that second bubble set for belonging, because we know how important safety and belonging are and really how they're interconnected and intertwined. So you'll see for ways to improve safety, we see increased police presence and patrols, then improved street lighting, and then we see address homelessness and mental illness issues. One thing I do want to uplift is that improved street lighting was a big theme that we saw in our 2019 assessment as well. So folks looking for improved lighting in their communities. And then for sense of belonging, we see host inclusive community events and activities, provide accessible public spaces for interaction, and then foster neighborhood connections. So these are ways that folks are wanting to feel integrated and part of their community, knowing their neighbors, and being, able to collaborate and really have a safe and thriving community where they live. An interesting data point just to kind of complement some of these solutions, and I know that there's quotes, present on the screen, but to complement some of these solutions with just some really interesting data was we asked a question around to both youth and adults. If someone in their family had been unfairly treated by someone in the community, so somebody, either themselves or a family member in Monterey County, had been treated unfairly by somebody else in the community in relation to a laundry list. We had all different kinds, for example, like race and ethnicity, we had education level, sexual orientation, identity, age, different components. But one of the highest responded to indicating yes responses we had was race and ethnicity, with 21% of adults indicating that someone in their family or themselves in Monterey County had been treated unfairly due to race and ethnicity. And we had 22% of youth indicating that, right? So really just uplifting unfair treatment, but also that discrimination that's still occurring in our community. And we saw some also differences in responses, which I think is really important. So we saw adults indicating that education level was a higher, rates higher than youth, so that somebody had been discriminated, either themselves or a family member, in the last 12 months. We saw 14% of adults indicating based on education attainment, and we saw youth at only 5%. But then when we look at that data point around sexual identity and orientation, we saw youth indicating higher percentages that either themselves or a family member in Monterey County in the last 12 months had faced unfair treatment. Youth indicating 12% of respondents who responded yes to that question, and then adults 9%. So that's just really interesting when we're thinking about maybe even the information that's being shared in families and between folks, but also the different experiences that youth and adults are having in relation to these components. Like I said, there's a huge list of a variety of different options, and that's present in the report. But I think these are really important concepts when we're thinking about barriers, especially to folks feeling safe, and also creating that sense of belonging in our community, which we know is so closely linked with safety, but also just creating positive spaces for folks to be able to thrive in our community as well. So with that, I know that we've shared a lot of data today. We can go to the last slide, and I'm really appreciative. Like I mentioned, our 2022 assessment is live, it's online. We have a really comprehensive report where we've tried to break out the data, make it super accessible. So as you go through that, please reach out to me, and you'll see my contact information here. It's all over the Impact Monterey County website, which is also hyperlinked in the presentation. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions, but also we're happy to generate really specific data sets if you're looking for something specific, in terms of maybe you're looking at a specific region, or you're looking for just, one question by age. We're able to really kind of dig into the data so that it can be useful, but just uplifting again what Henry said, that, by us all looking at data and really being data driven and using the same language and the same indicators and thinking about data in the same way, that's how we really can move the needle and understand needs and aspirations in our community. So I'm really appreciative of all the time that you guys have put in. And I know we're now going to be transitioning to breakout groups. So folks who are on Zoom, you will be put into a breakout group and you'll also have questions that get popped in the chat. So please have somebody on your team record some of the responses, and then we'll be able to touch base and collect those responses. And then for folks in the room, we'll be organizing breakout groups as well. And really the goal of these breakout groups are just to dig in and think about how what we've learned can be leveraged so that it goes beyond just this conversation and really gets integrated into how we are approaching best serving our community and really addressing some real needs and then especially some real aspirations as well. So thank you.
So maybe just mention that for folks in the breakout groups that ask someone to take the lead and document, the discussion, and then maybe email their comments to you.
Let's, in case you didn't hear that over Zoom, let's just make this a little bit easier. So please have somebody in your group, when you get sent your regular groups, record, like I mentioned before, the responses to the questions. And then we'll make sure that my email pops up in the chat. I know a lot of folks probably just saw it on the screen and maybe wrote it down, but we'll copy it there and you can just email over those responses and we'll be able to compile those that way as well. And then for folks in the room, we will be breaking you probably, I'm thinking like into 2 groups might be the most effective.
We've got like 45. I was gonna do 5 groups.
She was saying in the room.
Oh, and
Yeah, no, you're all right. So folks in Zoom land, you'll be getting broken up, and then the room will break you into 2 groups so you're able to dig in. And also for folks in the room, if you want to move tables and chairs so it's most comfortable, please do that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm good. What?
We are scribe.
But I'm back.
I'm the leader, right?